Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again for the Wargamer.com, and today I'm going to be playing part 3 of my Wargame Red Dragon AAR. In the last part 2, we were defeated in the Battle of Dagerao, and our South Korean forces were pushed back to the perimeter of the Pusan province. We are bordering the Pusan province on two other territories. The territory of Uchang is where this next battle will take place. If we are pushed back here, then Pusan will be seriously threatened by more than just one potential avenue for attack. Now, if Pusan falls, we lose this campaign, so it's obviously important for us to keep the North Koreans as far away from Pusan as possible. Unfortunately for us, we are heavily outnumbered, and the Battle of Uchang is going to be fought most likely at a severe disadvantage. I'm getting ready to deploy my forces here. You can see here the Dagerao province, if you will, is in the middle of the map. That's where we can deploy some troops. I want to make sure to get more than one headquarters unit in here on the map. As in previous battles, I was foolish in not having enough headquarters units, and that can lead you to an early defeat, because if all your headquarters units are lost, those units with the stars, then you lose the battle no matter what else is happening. So you want to make sure you keep those units safe and not necessarily away from the enemy, but hopefully not the focus of the enemy's attack. Now, I've talked a little bit about the gameplay here in past turns, so I don't think that I'm going to necessarily be doing that again this round. Instead, what I'd like to focus on is a discussion that I brought up here in the last video, is a discussion on allied armor. Now, the reason I'm doing this battle is because I'm going to have a large number of tanks that I'll be deploying here, because one of the units that I have in this hex is an armored unit. I don't have a ton of infantry to spare to place everywhere, but what I do have a lot of is tanks. So I'll probably bring in some F4s to provide some air cover with their Maverick missiles that'll destroy enemy tanks and hopefully keep the enemy off me. And then I'm going to buy a lot of tanks, or as many tanks as I can. You can see here I've got M48 A3Ks, and I've got M48 A5Ks. Now what those are variants of the American M48 tank. The M48 A3 was an American tank, and the M48 A5 was an American tank. The K variants were variants of the M48 that were slightly modified to better suit the needs of the Korean armed forces. And that's what I'm going to be talking a little bit about here in this video, as well as the general tone and quality of NATO armed forces. And obviously, while Korea isn't part of NATO, they certainly follow very closely to American and NATO military standards, as they work closely with many NATO allies throughout the Cold War, since Korea was a frontline location in the fight against communism. So anyway, as I was saying, the armored units that I'm going to be talking about here are primarily the Korean M48 tanks, but in general, the general tone of Allied armor throughout the Korean War, I'm sorry, not the Korean War, throughout the Cold War. Thankfully, there was no second Korean War. This topic is mainly Cold War armor, I'd say late 1940s through just before the M1 became commonplace, although I will touch on that briefly. I find the development of American armor, specifically during the Cold War, somewhat interesting, because unlike air units throughout the Cold War, which underwent radical changes in appearance, technology, and capabilities, American-designed armor seemed to remain fairly stagnant. In the late 1940s, the M46 Patton tank was designed to replace World War II M26 Pershing tanks. The M46 was then followed on by the M47, which is a further development of the same tank. The M48 followed the M47, which was again a further development of the same tank. And then the M60 followed that tank as well. All pretty much followed very similar layouts in terms of the chassis and the turret, same sort of profile, similar armaments, and in general seemed to really lack much in the way of innovation or dramatic departures from the previous designs. It wasn't until the late 1970s, early 1980s, with the emergence of the M1 Abrams tank, that American tank design really made a big leap forward. And again, this was in stark contrast to the way that most other designs, most notably air units, had been designed throughout the United States in the Cold War. It essentially was the same tank that was just upgraded in many ways from the late 1940s until the 1980s in terms of the American armed forces. Russia could be accused of doing the same thing with the T-54, T-55. I'd say the T-62 is a pretty different tank in terms of design capabilities and in some ways appearance than the T-55 line, and then the T-72 again more so. But I think the Russians had a more solid backing in terms of the layout of their tanks. American tanks tended to be pretty high off the ground. They tended to have very high profiles with large bulbous turrets, and again the appearance and design of the tanks really didn't change a whole lot from the late 1940s till the 1980s, whereas the Russians, while their designs in many ways look similar to each other, they tended to be lower to the ground. American tanks could arguably also have been undergunned for a lot of the Cold War. The M46, 47, and 48 all sported 90mm guns. The late models of the M48 did upgrade to a 105mm cannon, and then the M60 also had a 105mm cannon. But the Russian T-50 tanks in the 1950s already had 100mm plus guns. And they pretty much outgunned the American tanks all the way until you got into the Abrams era. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that Russian tanks were superior to American tanks. One thing that was very different is while Russian tanks were lower to the ground and harder to spot, and while Russian tanks had bigger guns, they didn't necessarily have the same quality fire control. This was an area that you'd see a lot of similarities between any number of industries throughout the Cold Wars, that Russian tanks, or Russian units in general, tended to be very well designed, tended to be very functional, often were maneuverable, such as the MiG-21, but they were somewhat crude when it came to electronics and fire control and other technology-based tools. They might have had a bigger cannon, but they weren't as accurate. They might have been lower to the ground, but they weren't as maneuverable. That's one thing that the American tanks tended to be, is very maneuverable. They placed a high priority on maneuverability. And the M48 tank here that we see here on the map here is an M48A3K. That is a US M48A3 tank, which has a 90mm cannon. The K version is a Korean version, which had a Korean fire control and upgraded fire control installed in the tank, so it was much more accurate. It still had a 105mm cannon, and it had I believe a diesel fuel tank instead of a gasoline fuel tank, or engine, sorry. The M48A5 K similarly had several upgrades for the Korean Armed Forces, but sported the 105mm cannon that the M48 did upgrade to, and it made it a better parity, or it made it more capable of dealing with Korean armed threats, or Cold War armed threats, but that the Soviets brought against them. But again, the profile of the T-55 tank is very low to the ground, and while the American tanks weren't as maneuverable, they were more maneuverable. They were certainly more easily spotted as well from a distance. Still, despite the advantages in design that the Russian tanks had, the more advanced fire controls that the American tanks had did seem to play out pretty well. One of the things that people don't seem to remember a whole lot is that throughout the Vietnam War, armor was actually used quite a bit, especially in the northern portion of the battlefield, in the sort of up near the DMZ. There weren't a whole lot of full-scale tank battles because the North didn't really deploy a lot of tanks, but toward the end of the war, I believe it was during the Easter Offensive, North Korea did bring many troops, many armored units south, and began attacking the South, or am I saying Korean? In Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese brought their armored units south and engaged South Vietnamese forces in many pitched battles as America was withdrawing from the war. There was actually an armored unit set up with American M48 tanks that did very well, and while it lost all of its tanks, it also inflicted dozens of casualties upon the Russian T-54s and T-55s opposing it. The biggest hindrance to the American armor was Russian anti-tank missiles as opposed to actual tank units. So that's an interesting observation that I've had, is that the superior fire control and maneuverability of the M48 tank did play out on the battlefield. However, you could argue that its poor profile meant that it was a much easier target for anti-tank guided missiles, and thus invalidated some of its advantages over Russian tanks, whereas Russian tanks would have been more difficult for infantry to engage with anti-tank weapons at a distance here. One other thing that occurred with the M48 was the last of the medium tanks in the U.S. Army. During World War II, you saw the trend of medium tanks being somewhat common. You'd have a heavy tank like the M26 Pershing, which was heavily armored, not very well mobilized, or not very mobile, and had a huge gun. And then you had medium tanks like the M4 Sherman tank, which had a weak gun, wasn't great at destroying other tanks, but was very good in infantry support. The U.S. Army continued developing these standards of tanks, with medium tanks designed to be more infantry support and just sort of general purpose tanks, while heavy tanks were designed specifically to counter enemy armored tanks, almost acting as tank destroyers. The M48 was the last of these tanks. The M60, which was its successor, was the first of the main battle tanks, which continued with the M1 Abrams. Now, I mentioned several of these lacking features, if you will, of the line of tanks that existed in the U.S. military from the 40s all the way to the 80s. One thing that did change is that in the 1980s with the M1 Abrams tank, you saw the United States go back to the drawing board and basically instill a low-profile tank, a heavy armor tank, and heavy cannon. So it had an up-armored 120mm smoothbore cannon firing depleted uranium shells. It had a low profile, in many ways similar to the Russian tank designs. It had upgraded armor, and it still had all the advantages of the superior fire control. The only thing it really lacked was what Russian units have, is the missiles that Russian units could fire, anti-tank guided missiles from their main cannon, giving them a slightly better range if they could see the target. But the M1 Abrams was revolutionary in American designs for that reason. It went from the high-profile, kind of traditional-looking tank of over 40 years to a low-profile tank. It went from an undergunned tank to an overgunned tank. It went from a moderately armored tank to an incredibly heavily armored tank, almost becoming a heavy tank, while at the same time, a heavy tank in the World War II sense of being like a tank destroyer, while at the same time being very capable in other regards as well. So that was an interesting development, if you look at the development in tank design, where it seemed like things were very stagnant in American tank design all the way up until the 1980s. And that to me is interesting. You didn't see the same sort of problems in German tank design with the Leopard tanks being much more in line with the low profile and fairly heavily gunned tanks. The British probably followed more closely to the American pursuits, but then adopted their own. Korea, interestingly enough, after purchasing American tanks with the M48A3 and A5 tanks, ended up designing their own tank. But what they did was they actually took the designs from the early stages of the M1 Abrams design and then contracted with, I believe it was General Dynamics, the developer of the M1 Abrams tank, to build a Korean version of the tank, which was more suited to combat in more rough terrain, such as mountainous terrain, and was a little bit more tailored toward the Korean Army in that sense. But it still used the early designs, I believe, still used the 105mm cannon, which actually the first M1 Abrams tanks used. The main battle tank version, the M1A1, used a 120, and the Koreans would upgrade that as well. They called their tank the K1, I believe, the K1 tank, which again, you see some similarities there with the M1 tank, and that the only difference between the M1 and the K1 in designation is the M and the K, and they look very similar. Again, the Koreans were not based on the late model Abrams tanks, so there are some differences that you can see, but they are very similar in many ways. You'll see here I'm going to be purchasing a lot of M48A5s. That's the 105mm tank. I'll be putting 16 of these in. I can just put a lot more of them in than the K1 tank because it's so much more expensive. So I'll be using that. And actually, Korea still uses the M48A or the M48K5. I believe also the M48A3K as well. I believe they have about 800 of those tanks still in service. I don't know if they're front line though, because they've got over 1,000 K1 tanks as well. But yeah, the Koreans still use some of the M48 tanks. They're not slated to be withdrawn from service in present day until the K2 comes out, basically like the M2, a more heavy tank, almost reverting back to the World War II designs of heavy tank versus medium tank, is slated to replace the M48 tanks. But the K2's been delayed several times already, so when that actually occurs, who knows? The M48 is still used, I believe, by Egypt. I think they have over 1,000 of those tanks still in service. So the United States built over 12,000 M48 tanks. There's still a lot of them out there, but it was a reasonably well designed tank, but it was just kind of an incremental upgrade. It wasn't anything dramatic. It wasn't a game changer. And if you could put the Western fire control inside of the Russian tanks, I think you'd definitely be able to say that Russian tanks were far superior. Fortunately for the West, fortunately for everyone, there was never an actual shooting war that started. But again, if there had been one, it would have been fortunate for the West that they did have such an advantage in terms of fire control computers and the ability to kind of negate some design flaws with superior computing power. Now, as you saw here, I did lose the Battle of Wuchang. I was forced out of that province, so now the enemy has 2 of the 3 neighboring provinces to Pusan are now in North Korean control. I'm now fighting in the last province that I have bordering Pusan, my last province that I have other than Pusan. So hopefully I can withstand the North Korean assault. The last battle, I just didn't have enough headquarters units. The enemy just completely overwhelmed me. I called in air support, but it wasn't enough, and I was just slowly ground back and driven back and eventually defeated. Actually, this kind of reminds me of the Tom Clancy novel, what is that called? Red Storm Rising, where the Russian attacks against the Western Allies suffered incredibly heavy casualties, and air units brought in, devastated the Soviet lines throughout that conflict, and yet the Russians were able to slowly just grind the Allies back with sheer weight of numbers. And it kind of reminded me, I wondered, it'd be interesting. Logistics plays a big role in this game, and I think it's done very well in that your units can run out of ammo, and unless you plan things right, you might not be able to get them resupplied, and it's not easy to plan things right and keep units supplied and in combat. And I think that's a very well done design trait in this game, in that it makes things much more thought-provoking in terms of your decisions and your purchasing decisions. But what I think would have been interesting is if there was some kind of supply system for air support units in the background. I mean, maybe that would be a little bit too in-depth or detailed. That'd be less mainstream and more kind of traditional wargamey, if you will. But I think it could have added an element to the game. If you only had a certain amount of ammunition that you could bring in off-map through supply units, and that kind of carried over throughout, I think that would have been a pretty interesting design choice, especially for air units, because I think of smart munitions. I call in F4s, and there's an enemy Su-25 Frogfoot that just destroyed 2 of my tanks with cluster bombs. I think to the F4s that I was calling in the last round, firing Maverick missiles, smart munitions, which while very effective, obviously the Allies only had a limited supply of these, and to expect them to be able to fly sortie after sortie after sortie and fire off missile after missile after missile, and then wonder, well, what's happening? How are those missiles getting replaced? I think it would have been interesting if there had been some kind of, especially, not to interrupt myself, but especially considering that North Korea or sorry, South Korea is almost entirely overrun in this scenario. You know, there's industry is almost entirely destroyed. They'd be totally reliant on shipments in from the United States, where if this was a surprise attack of some kind, which the scenario does imply, you know, there would have been no ability to ramp up weapon production. I know I remember reading something, granted it wasn't during the Cold War, but I remember reading something that basically said the U.S. Air Force used up almost all their smart munitions throughout the Afghan conflict in the early days, and that before the Iraqi conflict they actually had to pause basically for a while and ramp up production so they had enough munitions there to deal with them, and that kind of granted Cold War production I'm sure was higher, but still, if you can imagine the sudden need for thousands of these $1 million missiles that destroy tanks, and just F-4s flying in and shooting off 4 of them every single sortie, one's got to imagine that's going to cause you know, supply issues before too long. Maybe not right away, but it certainly wouldn't take too long for units to start burning through the majority of their ammunition. And again, that reminds me kind of that difficulty in Red Storm Rising for the Allied or the Western units to support their troops and withstand the enemy onslaught, and they really had no choice but to fire off literally all of their ammunition, or almost all of their ammunition, and yet at the same time that was going to hinder their ability to successfully operate in future engagements. TOW missiles, another good example of a smart munition that there's no way they would have had unlimited ammunition with. So it's just another interesting example of that. You can see here these Chona tanks. It doesn't say T-55 or T-54, it says Chona tanks. That's what I'm aiming for right now. Those are actually Korean copies of, I believe, the T-54 tank. So while it might look like they're Korean design, North Korean design that is, they really aren't. They're just copies of Soviet tank designs that were given a different name. There might have even been, you know, Chinese copies that were then sold, but I believe the North Koreans make their own tanks. I think they have a T-90 copy as well, but whether it's closer to a T-72 in performance or a T-90, I'm not sure, considering both tanks are very similar in appearance and design. But here I am using my my helicopters against these armored units. They're using their TOW missiles quite effectively. We've destroyed a number of enemy units here as we run low on ammunition, and I call on F-86 Sabres. It's amazing that in the 1980s F-86 Sabres would have still been in service. You know, for more than 30 years, when you know they came in, smart munitions didn't really exist. I think they fired off the first Sidewinders late in the Korean War, but still, just absolutely amazing to me when you consider how much technology had changed. I know we've got planes that have been flying just as long today. The F-16 comes to mind, that it's still in production, amazingly, 30 years from when it began production, but you know, avionics, computers, a lot of that's changed so that you can just upgrade aircraft now, and the aircraft body is less important than the avionics in it, and obviously you can upgrade computers, so if you can do that you can keep the aircraft relevant for decades, but still, in this era, you know, these planes were designed as gun platforms, not as missile platforms, as gun platforms, and to still have them flying around, even if only as air support, is interesting to me. So I'm doing a little bit better in this scenario at holding off the North Koreans. They're obviously driving south and threatening my my SEALs, but I've brought in some helicopters that have done a decent job of bringing the enemy down to size. Those 16 tanks of mine, while suffering somewhat heavy losses, more probably due to air attacks than anything, are holding their own. The enemy have kind of tried to drive down that street and have been really caught flat-footed. There's another enemy Su-25 airstrike there on my SEALs, but I'd rather they waste their cluster bombs on my SEALs than on my actual tanks. So enemy armor and buildings obviously difficult to deal with, and some more enemy tanks here approaching my main tank force, which apparently only has 4 tanks left, and I didn't even realize that. So maybe things aren't looking as bright as I thought they were. There we go. Alright, so use what's left of your missiles over there. These helicopters need to land so they can resupply their ammunition. Again, those are trucks I brought in, but once I use the supplies up for those trucks, I'll have no way to reload them, so that's kind of a conundrum there. The enemy has destroyed what's left of my armor, so now I'm stuck with air units and a couple of ground units, but my force is much more vulnerable now than they were before. See there, I didn't have many missiles, but I'm firing them off. Not terribly effectively either, so I've got 4 tow missiles left. Okay. 1 left. I don't know why those missiles are just like crashing into the forest below. I know I mentioned it in previous videos, but one thing that I do find mildly annoying is the terrain in this game is just so flat, and you might be able to get away with it in certain parts of Europe, but I don't think that's terribly realistic for a Korean conflict when half the island is basically a mountain. But lots of enemy armor units. Again, they look like T-55 clones there. My tow missiles aren't doing all that great in stopping these enemy units or destroying them. But apparently I now have collected 70% of the points you need. I did mention that you can win by destroying all the enemy headquarters units. Another way you can win is by destroying enough of the enemy units that some arbitrary number is reached, where you essentially make it too costly for the enemy to decide to continue their attacks. I would have to think if I was a commander of the North Koreans, I'd be a little bit concerned at this point. We'll call in some K1 tanks. That should turn the tide. Bringing in 4 M1 basically tanks to fight off some enemy T-55s should make this a slam dunk here. We will wrap this video up after this battle, though. I know I fought 2 battles here, but I usually try to keep these episodes at about 30 minutes. We're approaching that 30-minute mark now, so hopefully these K1s will turn the tide in our second fight today. I'd hate to lose both battles when it's going to leave me down to my last province if I don't win them. So calling some more cargo troops so we can rearm these helicopters, and we'll kind of go over here and bring them down. Wait a minute, that's a Su-20. Oh. So the enemy called in an airstrike, which destroyed my only headquarters unit, which is why you definitely want to make sure you've got more than 1 headquarters unit. Now that means that that province is lost as well, even though I did inflict much heavier casualties on the enemy than they on me. I've been driven back to the very borders of Pusan. We are in our last territory here. Fortunately, it looks like the American forces have arrived here and are planning a landing similar to the historical Incheon landing during the actual Korean War in the 1950s, where the Americans landed troops behind enemy lines as they had pushed into the Pusan perimeter in the southeast and basically cut off a large percentage of the North Korean army and turned the tide of the war at that point. It was a brilliant maneuver by General MacArthur, and I will be doing the same thing here. One would think that it'd be a little bit predictable for doing the same exact thing. You might expect the North Koreans to be waiting for us, but anyway, I'll bring these troops in here. You can see in the southeast in Pusan, I am down to my last province there. I can't, unfortunately, it looks like, call in American reinforcements to Pusan, which seems a little unrealistic. I would think we could pump some extra troops in there to help them hold the line while our other force lands to the north. If anything, it would also be more realistic, I would think. It'd be somewhat of a distraction if the Koreans all of a sudden see a bunch of American troops in the south. They're probably much less likely to think that the Americans are about to land a huge force to the north. But anyway, I'm going to throw some reinforcements in here, and we are right around the 30-minute mark, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cut this episode 3 off here, and then we'll continue the fighting in episode 4 on our next turn. Hopefully we can hold Pusan that turn and then also land and take Seoul and kind of turn the tide and quickly turn this battle and this war around. But that'll be a discussion for another time, and I hope you enjoyed watching. If you did, I would appreciate if you go ahead and hit the like button there and subscribe. I'm trying to put out about one of these a week for the Wargamer.com, and I just want to thank them as well for asking me to go ahead and do this. But yeah, that's gonna just about do it here today for me. This is gonna be the end of this video, the end of part 3, and until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thanks for watching, and I'm signing out.